Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
We are all caregivers at some time of our life. For many people, all of their lives, and for some, much more intensely than others. What happens to different people when they're thrown into the world of caregiving for someone full-time? People don't enter the world of unpaid caregiving voluntarily. Do you know anyone who's in this situation? Now, more than 50 million people in the United States are caregivers for loved ones. Most are women, and many are women of colour. They're often unpaid or underpaid. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a survey of disability, ageing and carers in 2018, it was found to be 2.65 million people, or 1 in 10 Australians, in the role of informal carers, and 7 out of 10 of those were female. I'm Kate Mason, and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you to the ones you care about the most. Today I'm talking to Kate Washington. Kate's a mother of 2 daughters, a freelance writer, and author of Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. Already Toast tells the story of Kate's struggle to care for her seriously ill husband. She looks at the unpaid role that family caregivers play in a society that fails to provide them with the structural, emotional, and financial support that is needed. Kate, her husband Brad, and their 2 daughters were living a normal life until Brad was diagnosed with a rare form of lymphoma, accompanied by some equally rare side effects. Kate and Brad's previous lifestyle came to a grinding halt when this diagnosis was made, as it was necessary for Kate to become his caregiver. Brad's treatment spanned several years, and he eventually had to take early retirement. In her book Already Toast, Kate reflects that her family were fortunate enough to have good medical coverage and the funds to pay for care that wasn't covered by insurance. Sadly, however, they could not avoid the emotional strain of the situation. An online stress assessment revealed to Kate, as she was partway through her journey as a full-time caregiver, "You're already toast." By the time Kate wrote and published her book, Brad was in remission. Hello, Kate. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Kate, you sent me your book, and I really enjoyed it, if I can say that in that sense. It was actually quite a stressful read because you went through such a stressful time, but it's so relatable and so moving, and I think it's actually an essential read if people are listening to help us all understand the depth of caregiving and how far caregiving can go. A lot of us are actually currently in caregiving situations without really thinking about that. You know, like when I was reading your book, I started thinking about who was I actually looking after in my life. And yes, there's a lot of unpaid caregiving happening, but it hasn't affected me to the extremes that you were affected, you know, that you talk about in your book. So what I'd love you to do is just let us know, how did it all start for you, this intense caregiving?
Well, I think you make a really wonderful point that a lot of us are engaged in caregiving long before we identify as caregivers, and that was certainly the case for me. I was not thinking about caregiving at all. I was about 42 years old, and my younger child was just starting kindergarten. And I was thinking to myself, because I'm a freelance writer, I was thinking, well, I've made it to where my caregiving responsibilities are going to lighten up. I'm going to have a lot more time. And in fact, right as she started kindergarten one day, and I was thinking about, what are my next projects going to be? My then husband came to me in the kitchen, and he's always worn a beard, and he had his hand along his jawline, and he said, I have these funny lumps here. Do you think I should go to the doctor? And I looked at him and I thought, yes, you should. Because he'd also lost a lot of weight over the past 6 months. He's not a big guy, and he'd lost probably 30 pounds. And I didn't think of that as an act of caregiving, but it was actually the start of the journey. And it took about 6 months for him to get diagnosed with a very rare form of lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, and then even longer to decide on treatment and figure out what to do. So it was a long time when I wasn't thinking of myself or really acting as a full-time caregiver, but I was doing a lot of the background tasks that a lot of caregivers do. I was calling the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. That's an advocacy organization we have here in the US. I was, providing emotional support. I was thinking about what our plans would be. I was going with him to doctor's appointments. And then everything changed very suddenly. His cancer turned very aggressive. He was hospitalized with actually a ruptured lung tumor on an emergency basis and had to start chemotherapy very, very quickly. His lung collapsed. He went into very serious chemo for the duration of a summer. That was in 2015. And after he finished chemo, he relapsed very quickly. And the only treatment option left was a stem cell transplant or bone marrow transplant. And fortunately, his brother was a match for that. Unfortunately, it came with a lot of complications and was a very, very hard road. He was hospitalized for 4.5 months. He was very, very close to dying. In fact, there were several occasions on which I just thought that was it. He was terminal. And it was incredibly stressful, incredibly difficult. And when he was in the hospital, he was isolated. Our children, who were 9 and 5 when he was diagnosed, couldn't see him, and he was too sick to even do anything like FaceTime. So I was pulled between the hospital and home, between caregiving responsibilities for my children and being in the hospital as an advocate. And then once he came home, it actually all got much harder because he needed very intense care at home. He came home, he had lost his vision in the hospital. So he came home blind, unable to walk across the room, unable to eat a full diet. So he was on IV nutrition that I had to administer. There were a number of other hands-on tasks, and that's something I can talk about, how the caregiving tasks that are highly medical and technical have really increased for home and family caregivers in recent decades, at least here in the US. And when he was discharged, his primary doctor said to me, he can't be left alone even for a minute. He needs 24-hour eyes on him. And I said, well, that's impossible. How can I do that? Because not only did I have children, I had to sleep and eat and do other things. And he said, well, usually family steps in and it works out fine. And Brad's family, my husband's family, had been here helping for months. They live in Canada, so they were going to have to go back. We have a strong network of family and friends, but that's an unreasonable thing to ask, to provide 24-hour care. And here in the US, I really found that a very galvanizing question or moment for me, because I realized, 24-hour care was being medically ordered. His doctor said it was essential, but it was not covered by insurance. We ended up having to dip into savings to hire in-home help. And it really just came to me in that moment and in all the months around it and after, how big and how unseen I don't want to say burden, but the responsibility that's placed on family caregivers is.
So in reality, you were actually being almost a doctor. You were having to intravenously feed your husband and do things that perhaps a medically trained person should be doing, but that was given to you as a wife and caregiver rather than being a hospital thing.
Yes, and he'd had that round the clock in the hospital. He couldn't eat at all, so he'd had to relearn to eat. And I was involved in that as well by bringing in homemade broths and things like that to the hospital. But when he came home, he had a very severe reaction to his bone marrow transplant that's called graft versus host disease. It's like a rejection, and it affected him in the digestive system. So he was unable to eat for a long time, and in fact still has some digestive issues due to that. And yes, so he needed nightly intravenous nutrition, and there was a pump, and he had a port and I had to hook it up, and I was always worried about infection or about doing it wrong or a bubble in the line. And that was just one of a lot of different, very highly medicalized tasks that I was tasked with.
So how does the normal person do it? If this was you, obviously highly intelligent and having, well, fortunately, the time, not really the time. That's a huge question for the medical system, isn't it? And how do normal, people cope?
I really think it is a big question that our medical system certainly has to grapple with here. And I know that that's better in many other countries where the medical system is a little bit more humane.
Yes.
But I think here cost cutting has often resulted in a kind of hospital to home movement that places really undue burdens on families. And we were so fortunate in so many ways. I am educated. I could speak to the doctors. I have, there are many people who, for whom English is not a first language or who live very far from the hospital. And there's a huge rural medicine shortage here. So people who have to travel a long way, or, even with the IV nutrition, I got a giant box that was on ice packs every week, and just having the refrigerator space to store that and being at home to receive it in a timely fashion. And there were other drugs that had to come by special delivery and had to be treated very meticulously. And I think that one point that I do like to make is that these responsibilities that are placed on caregivers are not just bad for the caregivers, they're often quite bad for the patients, because outcomes cannot be great when people are so stressed at home that they can't provide a reasonable standard of care.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you have your children to care for. You had yourself to care for, which wasn't happening in that sense. So can you tell us about how you got to being almost toast?
Yeah, and I'll say that the title of my book, Already Toast, comes from...
Toast.
Yeah, it comes from
Almost.
after... There was a period when I was almost toast, that's for sure, and then I got there.
Yeah.
It comes from an online quiz that I took after I had a bit of a breakdown in my husband's oncologist's office after he'd come home from that stem cell transplant. And he said, you need to take better care of yourself. So I went home and Googled to look for resources and found instead a quiz, and took the quiz about caregiver burnout, and it came up with the result, you're already toast. And I kind of tucked that phrase away. And yeah, my children were in elementary school, as I said, when Brad became ill. And they were 9 and 5, then 10 and 6, kind of through the worst of it. And this was all in 2015 and 2016. So they're teenagers now.
Yes.
But it was quite difficult to try to keep their care in mind alongside the extreme stress, and also keep the degree to which they were struggling with having their dad, who'd been a very involved dad, of course, like he was so ill and was suddenly just absent. So I was coordinating therapy and support for them of different kinds. I was also really trying to be mindful through a lot of it that this was their one childhood. They did not get a second shot at being kids. And so I did try always to carve out time when they could just be kids. They went to a summer camp here that is a nonprofit camp that's specifically for children affected by a parent's cancer, and it's free. And they started going when my little one was 6 years old, which is the youngest a kid can go. And it's a sleepaway camp, and they still go. And my older daughter, who's about to start university, in part chose her university based on the ability to volunteer for one of the camps, because the counselors are all college students. So she wants to carry that forward and still be involved. So it was and has been very meaningful for them. I also sometimes chose to prioritize them, not over my husband, but instead of him and his care. We had great support, as I said before, from his parents. And on a few occasions, like there was one time when they were on spring break and he was still in the hospital, and I took them to San Diego and to the beach instead of staying to continue to be going back and forth to the hospital because I wanted to be able to spend that time with them and do something fun. I needed the break and they needed the break, and that was really critical. And then later, there was another time when Brad actually received a terminal diagnosis, and then his oncologist found a clinical trial that helped him. And that clinical trial was in New York for the entire month of December of 2016. And we live in California, I should say. So it's across the continent.
Right.
And his parents from Canada offered, they said either they could come to California and stay with the girls for the month so that I could go to New York, or they could go to New York and support Brad. And I very consciously chose to stay with the kids, also in part because I did need the break, but I just felt that they'd been through so much change, so much difficulty. I didn't want to be away from them for Christmas. I wanted to be there and go through our holiday traditions and keep those alive for them. And I still feel it was the right choice.
Yeah. And do you talk about them now they're older? Do you talk about what happened and how they felt about it, and how they felt about your choices to take them and do these things? Are they great memories for them? And have they still developed relationships with both of you? And what do those relationships look like now?
Well, I should say my husband and I are separated, so our relationships are quite independent at this point, but we do still do things as a family. When my older daughter just graduated from high school, we went together to the graduation. We had a family dinner. And their relationship with Brad is, I would say, quite strong. They're traveling with him now. He's doing considerably better, though he still is disabled and considered disabled by his illness. But they're on a trip even as I speak. And they and I, we talk intermittently about how hard it was, not all the time, because I think they don't love some of those memories. Though the fun memories, the trips and the things that we did, they do talk about in a warm way. Mm-hmm. But it has been interesting as they've gotten older to hear some of their reflections back on that time. I just recently was talking with my older daughter and had not really realized the extent to which she understood that Brad was very close to death in 2016 on more than one occasion. And she was 10 years old. I wasn't talking directly about that in front of her, though I was in communication with her therapist about how to handle that with her and whether I should prepare her and my younger daughter. And in a conversation, she said to me that she really thought and understood that he would die, which thankfully was not the case. But, I realized that there was a lot going on in their little minds that I, in my busyness, didn't know, or that they were keeping private or only discussing with their therapist with whom they have a very close relationship. And those were really critical supports that we were lucky to be able to access for them.
Did you ask her if she would have preferred that you would have handled it a different way from that perspective at that age? Did she say, I wish you'd told me, or I wish you'd said it differently? Or she just knew more and that's what she was thinking about?
Yeah, it wasn't really that kind of conversation. She didn't say that, but, we have talked about their awareness of how much I was doing as a caregiver. And in fact, my older daughter has read my book, which was interesting to me, that she would. And there are probably some things that I put in there because it is pretty raw in a lot of places that I might rather she had not read. But at the same time, I have two daughters, and one of the points I make in the book, and something I talk about a lot, is that there is a real gender inequity around caregiving and the cultural ideas of who a caregiver is, what a caregiver should do, how much of their life they should give up for those responsibilities. And as a mother of daughters, I think often about what their lives as caregivers may look like in the future, and how they may want to set boundaries around those kind of responsibilities, or consider that in their lives. So it's something.
No, I agree with you.
That, I dedicated the book to them and said in hopes that this landscape, this cultural landscape around gender will look different when they are older.
Yes.
Dedicated it to them and also to caregivers more generally, because I think there are so many unsung, unseen people behind the scenes, behind closed doors, doing so much grueling and difficult work.
Absolutely. Who don't have a voice, so can you describe what it feels like to be unseen? You're sitting there doing all of that. And another part of the caregiving that you took during this time wasn't really just about the kids and Brad. It was also about all the relatives and friends. So what did you have to do for those people as well while you were looking after him, in contacting, give us a description of that, because to me that was tough enough. I find it hard enough to send a text when I'm going to be late or something, let alone being the relayer of everything.
Yeah, we did set up at my suggestion a blog where we could inform people and keep people up to date on his treatment. And I'm so glad we did, because it was really difficult to manage those kind of communications. And I do want to underscore the point that, in sociology, they call that kin work, getting in touch with people. And that is another kind of labor that is disproportionately done by women, maintaining those relationships and things. And it is just really difficult in a time of stress to repeat the story over and over, things like that. And in a way that feels, not traumatic for the other person. You don't want to end up telling them something and then comforting them when you're the one
needing comfort,
which has happened to me in cases of talking once when I had to share, the news of my mother's passing, ending up comforting the person I was talking to.
That can be very very stressful, and it kind of that is the life thing.
But I will also say that I was fortunately the recipient of care back. Our family was, people brought us meals for months, honestly. People helped by taking care of the children. And the best of those were the people who just offered and said, we had one friend who said of my younger daughter, Lucy, who was, as I said, 5 and 6 at the time, her best friend's dad just said, just bring her over every Sunday, no questions asked. We'll take care of her the whole day.
Wow.
And that
so she was
gave
part
her the
of a
chance
family.
And that gave her the chance to be a kid and play with them, and freed me up, and was a wonderful gift. So, those things go both ways, but it is a challenging thing within the family and outside of the family. And you end up, to go back to your original question about feeling unseen, it can be so hard to convey what it's like. And I think for many caregivers, as it was the case for me, the negative emotions that come up around it are not palatable. It does not feel like something you want to share, that you're angry at the circumstance or even at the person that you're caring for because of a disagreement or because it's frustrating, or that you feel resentful of how your life has been taken over. And I wrote, or tried to write honestly about those emotions in the book, because they are very natural. If you give up your whole life to do something, it's not easy. And you often don't really get much of a choice. And I've heard from a lot of caregivers that they felt more seen and more recognized from reading my book,
yes,
or from, hearing me speak about caregiving. And that has been very rewarding for me.
Because that's very true. And so people often wouldn't speak out about that because they'd also feel really terrible because they're caring for this person, but there's that anger and that feeling. Did you have someone you could talk to? Did you have a psychologist or someone that you could talk to and express those things to?
Yes, I was in therapy, and so I had a therapist, and it was mostly just, unloading about the stresses during the time. And I have a close circle of friends who are very, very supportive, people who I could reach out to and turn to
Yeah.
anytime. A group chat, as it were,
Yes.
and that was very, very supportive. So I certainly felt I had those supports in place. And for me, what was harder was anything social that was kind of outside of that inner circle, both because I didn't really have the time. So a lot of acquaintanceships or friendships that I enjoyed, but that weren't my closest, tightest circle, kind of lapsed during that time because I didn't have the time. And also because I would feel often self-conscious in a group setting. I didn't have anything fun to share. Nobody wants to hear about what it's like to hook up somebody's IV. Like, it's not great cocktail party conversation. And so I think that contributes to that feeling of invisibility too. Caregivers often don't have the time to advocate for themselves, to socialize, and then they feel self-conscious or feel, they don't have much to add to a conversation because of the nature of their lives during the difficult parts of a caregiving journey. I think if people can find support groups or other caregivers they can connect with, and I think online support is a wonderful avenue for people, because it can often also be, on a message board where it's not dependent on everybody coming to the same place at the same time.
Because if people don't have that, then this could, it might be a never-ending caregiving role that's never going to change. As yours has changed, some people are there and literally not forever, but in that sense, not having a person to talk to or someone to say something to, and it must be awful, really awful.
Yeah, I think the average duration of caregiving in the U.S. is 4.5 years, which is quite a very long time. And I also want to underline that for many, many caregivers, it ends not in the person getting better, but in grief and loss. And studies have shown that often those are the times at which people are the most vulnerable to depression, to anxiety, when the role ends, because all of the emotions you've had to put on hold during the real intensity of caregiving come roaring back, and then you have to grapple with them. So as caregiving fades away, either because the person becomes more independent and has improved in their health, or through grief or loss, those are times when caregivers really need to be attentive to getting the supports that they need. And friends and family, I think need to keep an eye out and say, not like, oh, well, their work there is done, but how can I continue to support them as they're rebuilding their life and going back to different kinds of roles?
Yeah, that's a great point, because it's so true, isn't it? Oh, well, it's all good now and they'll leave you, and there's a huge hole sitting there too, as well as emotionally, a huge hole in your time that was once filled with caring for someone as well. So for you, as that burden lifts and your sick person's recovering, what did that leave behind for your family dynamic? You've spoken about you separating. So you're independently working again now, and Brad, he had to retire, is that correct?
Yes, he was an English professor at our local university, and because he is immune compromised and still does have quite a lot of medical treatment and kind of unpredictable, feelings of tiredness, it's kind of an invisible disability, but it's still very much there. So he did take a disability retirement a number of years ago. Our dynamic really ebbed and flowed as he began to get better, because sometimes he would need more care or have challenges. Anytime he gets sick or gets a fever, it is very much more serious than it would be for the average person. So as things changed with his health, my caregiving would come and go dependent on his health. And one thing that was very interesting, I would say around the time he recovered his vision, which was in 2017 and 2018, he had a series of eye surgeries and he did recover his vision. He began to be able to manage his care much more independently. But when the pandemic hit, that all changed and went backwards because as an immune compromised person, he needed to be protected from the outside world. And so I was that interface with the world. At the same time, our marriage had really changed drastically over the course of his years of needing care. And though we worked on it for a long time and really tried to shift our dynamic back, it was just very challenging. And we realized after a long time of that we were better as friends at this point. And so while it's amicable and we do now live in separate houses, and we share custody of our daughters 50-50, though now one of them is 18, so we don't have custody with her anymore. She's off to university next week as I'm speaking to you now. But it really did change and shift. And I think that those changes in relationship dynamics are really tough on caregivers of all stripes. You know, if people are caring for a parent, perhaps who has dementia, that role reversal of suddenly the child being in the role of the parent can be really, really difficult, and really emotionally taxing to navigate for both the people in the care relationship. Spousal caregiving often has, you know, for some families, it brings them closer together. And for some families, they're just not able to navigate the change. And we were the latter.
Yes. Yeah. So if you're talking, like we're talking now, and someone's listening and they are in a caregiving role themselves and feeling pretty stressed about it, or they know someone like that, you were already toast. And when someone told you to relax or find something to do, it was really hard for you to find something to do because it was just another stress to find something to relax. So what would be your advice to tell them or them to tell other people when they notice that someone's stressed? What, you know, because when someone said it to you, it was like, really? Where do I find that time? What would you advise them to do or say?
I mean, I think the advice is different but related for the caregiver themselves or the friends or family or support network of the caregivers. I would say for the caregivers, ask for and accept the help you need and take that help perhaps earlier than you think you need it. I have a hard time asking for help, and that has changed a little bit because I just needed it so badly. But it can be difficult, you know, for somebody who's used to being competent and coping with whatever happens to reach out and ask for that help. I like to say, you know, self-care is often prescribed for caregivers and it's become a real buzzword. But I like to say that what caregivers really need is community care. We all do, of course, need self-care and to care for ourselves, but we also need a network and we need community connections to support us and buoy us up. And I would say to the people who know a caregiver who's starting to seem stressed, you know, offer specific help. If you can avoid saying like, let me know what I can do, and instead text your friend and say, I'm going to the market today. Is there anything you need? Feel free. Like, if so, text me and I'll get it. If not, feel free, you know, to ignore this text or you don't have to respond. The texts that give people permission not to respond if they're overwhelmed or stressed, are wonderful. The text that offers or outreach that offers specific help is wonderful. It can be really hard. It was for me when a caregiver is really overtaxed to even decide what to ask somebody. And if you need some weird random thing, like you need your lawn mowed or you need the car filled up with gas, it feels really uncomfortable to ask a friend for something like that. So offering anything, I think, is a really helpful way to go here. And I'm not sure if you have this available in Australia, but there are a couple of apps now that actually let people have a list of what they need as support. And then their circle of friends or their supporters can log in and see like, oh, that person needs laundry detergent. Like, I'll check that off the list.
That's a wonderful idea.
Nice way to get that support without having to make the direct ask in a way that can feel uncomfortable.
They are great insights, Kate. Thank you very much for that. And thank you so much for sharing your story. And I wish you all the very best. And I wish you all the very best with getting your daughter off to college. I know these things can often be quite sad. And as I've said to you earlier before we started talking. In Australia, we don't have that, and ours is still around the place. But thank you so much again for sharing your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
With such insights into the lack of awareness of those who are in an unpaid caregiving role, both financially and emotionally, government and societal changes need to be made. It's important for us all to understand and act on, as this is a collective problem that's only going to become bigger. Making sure that you have the time to take time out from caring for others can be a burden in itself. It must feel right for you. Work out what kind of person you are. Are you an extrovert? You might find energy and relaxation in the company of others and being out in an external world that energizes you. Or are you an introvert? You might find your ideal energy booster is time alone or engaging in quiet activities such as gaming, reading, meditation, or chatting to a close friend or partner. Or are you an intuitive type? Would activities using your intuition, creativity, and big picture ideas bring you happiness and self-fulfillment? Or do you prefer sensing? Does sticking to a more familiar, normal routine help you stay on track and feel happy? To all caregivers out there listening, please know that what you're doing is important and valued, even though it may never be verbalized or physically shown. Please talk to someone who understands and work out what's your emotional and physical time out, and then make it happen. Don't keep your stress inside your head. No one can read your mind. Ask for help. Communicating your needs to someone who cares about you is so important. Knowing yourself and your personality can also help to prevent you from becoming burnt toast. I'm Kate Mason, and thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review. That would help others learn about the podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book on Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.